I'm sure this was on your bingo card for how preachers would start their sermons this week, but did anyone go see the Odyssey? Yeah. Yeah, I was really mailing it in this week for sermon introductions. I thought, all right, the Odyssey, that's an easy one to go with. The Odyssey, right? I'm sure some of you saw it. Christopher Nolan, the fantastic director who took this ancient epic and brought it to life, right, in fresh new perspectives. It doesn't hurt that you have a cast like that to bring it to life, but it was a huge hit. It made hundreds of millions of dollars on its opening weekend across the world. I was at a local bookstore yesterday with my family who's in town, and I even saw they had a whole table dedicated to a display of Odyssey and Odyssey-related literature. And I've even heard it said, I did not confirm this with my own eyes, but a source told me that teenagers were perusing Homer's Odyssey at the bookstore. They're going to be very disappointed when they open it up, I can tell you that, but it's not quite like Christopher Nolan's interpretation. There's no Anne Hathaway or Matt Damon or Robert Pattinson. But it's incredible. I don't know if you got to see it. It's a fantastic work. It's amazing to watch and listen to. And of course, it's an epic, so it's rather long. But I think the genius behind it is that Christopher Nolan's able to take something that's ancient and from another world, another culture, another time, and bring it to life by asking new questions of it. Perhaps looking at it with different eyes. And with his modern understanding, he can take something that's old and unpackage it for us who are contemporary audiences and still get something from this thousands of years old tale about Odysseus. Now, I'm amazed that we're willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars as citizens of this globe. And then we have this other ancient collection of stories right here. And we don't know what to do with it, right? I don't see Christopher Nolan making this story from Genesis 29 into a box office hit anytime soon about Jacob's story, although I think it'd be incredible. In some ways, Jacob's life kind of parallels Odysseus' own journeys about a man who's trying to find his way back home, about trying to discover who he is and all the things he's been through and the different obstacles that he encounters, including family members. But I think it's interesting that when we come to this thing called the Bible, we don't approach it like Christopher Nolan approaches the Odyssey. Instead, we take one or two paths. We either look at this thing and we immediately put it under lock and key, right? We come to stories, whether it's this one about Jacob working for Rachel and Leah, or maybe it's some other kind of story that we don't understand, and we put it under lock and key and we said, well, this is just how it is. I assent to it. I believe it, but I'm not really going to probe it. I'm a little afraid to interrogate it, so I'm just going to say, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it. So we might treat it with like we have white gloves on when we read these stories, or maybe we don't read them at all, right? We come across a story like Genesis 29, we say, man, this is archaic. Wow, it's really backwards. I don't need to listen to it. I think I'm just going to ignore this one and stick with Jesus and the Gospels. One or two ways we tend to approach these stories, particularly stories in the Hebrew collection of texts. But what if there was another way, a third path we could take, something similar to how Christopher Nolan approaches the Odyssey? What if we could read ancient texts by asking new questions, taking unexpected perspectives, and seeing what might come to life from that fresh vantage point? I know we're already stumbling when we come across stories like Genesis 29, and I'm not going to avoid talking about it. We're not going to do the true love waits sermon here for Rachel and Jacob. Instead, we're going to address it head on, right? But before we get there, I just want to remind you that the past 3 weeks, we've been in our Jacob era of the stories of the mothers and fathers, right? Past 3 weeks, we've been following this devious, deceitful man named Jacob. 2 weeks ago, we saw him trick his brother Esau into selling his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. A part we didn't read here on Sunday, but if you are familiar with the narrative of Genesis, Jacob again tricks his family into getting a blessing from his aging, decrepit father, Isaac, who's blind and cannot see. So Jacob takes advantage of both his brother and his father, and eventually he's going to pay for those irresponsible behaviors, those deceitful relationships. So he goes on the run, and last Sunday we encountered Jacob in the wilderness with only a rock for his pillow. And in this moment of vulnerability and exposure, when we feel no sympathy for Jacob because he's finally getting his comeuppance for all that he's done, the Lord appears to Jacob in a dream and makes unilateral, unequivocal promises to Jacob, a man who's not worth trusting. God says, I am with you wherever you go, and I will be with you until I have done all that I have promised you. Now today we see Jacob no longer in the wilderness, in the in-between place, but now he's arrived at his destination. He's made it all the way across the desert to his uncle's residence. Laban is his uncle, and Jacob begins to serve his uncle for 7 years in exchange for the hand of his cousin, Rachel. But you might have been a little distracted because of some glaring and difficult features of this story. If we're in 2026 here in Western civilization, we immediately pick up on how this story treats women, right? It's problematic. It's really hard to see women being treated like livestock. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the Hebrew names Rachel and Leah, what you'll find is Rachel actually means ewe, which is a female sheep. And Leah can mean weary, it can mean tired, but it can also mean wild cow. So you've got wild cow and female sheep who are now caught in the middle of some raging male egos, being herded back and forth between two families. It's a little problematic for us, especially women here in the room, to see these women have no agency, no say in the matter, but just being passed around. It might also be problematic that two sisters are marrying the same man, which happens to be their cousin. One of my friends and mentors, Reverend Ben Trammell, used to say that when people would come to him and say, you know what our society needs today is biblical family values, he would always ask a clarifying question and say, which biblical family values are you referring to? Because these, according to the text, these are some biblical family values. A man goes to his uncle and marries his two cousins who happen to be sisters. A little problematic. But you especially probably feel for Leah, the elder of the two sisters, who not only has no agency, no voice in this narrative, but is used by her father and then ignored by her now husband. At best, Leah's in the way, an obstacle for Jacob to get who he really wants, Rachel. So it can be really hard for us to hear stories like this one as modern audiences. And usually we take one of two paths. We either say, well, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. We keep it at arm's distance. We might check our brains at the door when we walk in here and we just say, well, God's ways are more mysterious than mine. Or maybe we don't want to hear it at all, right? We say, this is exactly why I don't read these stories. So I'm going to stick to the New Testament instead. We think that they have nothing to say to us. But what if there was a third way? What if there was another way to approach these ancient texts that can be troubling for us as modern readers, but what if we could be curious about them, be humble with them, and trust that they could still offer some life-giving wisdom for us in this day and age? Throughout our time in Genesis this summer, I've been learning from a man, the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Orthodox Jewish congregations in Great Britain, who actually served in the House of Lords. And in 2007, he gave a lecture at Duke University, so you knew that was going to come in here. He was at Duke University speaking on behalf of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and he gave a great talk about interreligious dialogue between the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in order to do this, he journeyed with the audience through the sibling narratives of Genesis, which we've seen a few already, right? We saw Isaac and Ishmael that John preached on. We saw Jacob and Esau just a couple of weeks ago. And now we have another sibling dynamic, Leah and Rachel. And when going through these stories, Rabbi Sacks says there's a couple of things you can do with the narratives from Genesis. One is to just pay attention to the surface narrative, the story that's most obvious, the one we would use as a summary. So we come to Genesis 29, and we say, all right, this is what happened. We recount the events of the story. Jacob shows up. He works 7 years for Rachel. Instead, he gets Leah, so he has to work a little longer, and now he has both. And it's obvious that Rachel is the one that's chosen. Leah is just kind of there, but she'll be part of the story somehow, not quite as important as Rachel. That would be like the surface narrative. We would read the story as it's actually told. Rachel and Jacob are the chosen ones, the important ones. Leah, not so much. But Sachs says there's another way to read these stories in Genesis, another narrative at play just underneath the surface, what Rabbi Sachs calls the counter narrative. And you find the counter narrative in these Genesis narratives by asking yourself the question, where do my sympathies lie in the story? To whom is my heart drawn? Certainly not to Jacob and Laban, is it? Two men who are out deceiving each other, right? We don't have any sympathy for Jacob, but now we don't have sympathy for Laban either, how he's treating both his nephew and his daughters. So we have some sympathy for the women who are just being shuffled to and fro, but perhaps not having any role to play. But our hearts are especially drawn to Leah. The one who, this translation says, whose eyes are lovely. It can also mean sad. It can mean tender. It might be suggesting that there's some kind of inner beauty at work in Leah, while Rachel's beauty is all visible and on the outside. Nevertheless, how she's treated by all the men in the story is not very impressive. She's just there and eventually cast aside. But what if that counter narrative is the way we're supposed to read a story like this one? What if when we ask the question, to whom are our hearts drawn, is the way that this story was always intended to be understood? So now I have a quote for you from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs on the screen. This is what he said from his lecture in 2007. And we begin to understand the immense project the Bible is undertaking, which is to tell a series of stories which seem to say one thing on the surface, but actually say something quite different beneath. On the surface of Genesis 29, what we're getting is that true love waits. Jacob's willing to work for the one he loves, and he'll work 14 years to get Rachel, the one whom he desires. And so we lift up this couple as the ideal couple, forgetting or ignoring Leah. But what if this narrative underneath the surface is the one that these stories always wanted us to receive? That it's the ones who are easily cast aside and ignored and avoided, used and abused. It's those people that we're supposed to pay attention to. What if it's the ones who go unnoticed that these stories from Genesis want us to notice? The ones who seem rejected are actually the ones whom God has chosen, the ones whom God desperately desires. Perhaps this is another way to read it. And like Christopher Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey, when we assume this new perspective, seeing the story from Leah's eyes, the ancient wisdom comes to life. That when we begin to pay attention to Leah in Genesis 29, perhaps we then begin to ask the question, who am I ignoring today in my world, in the story God is telling in my life? That I'm so set on one particular person or one particular goal that people who are in my periphery, who are in the collected audience, I just cast aside. I avoid. Or even worse, I use to get my way. What if these stories are passed down from generation to generation so that we might actually see our world differently? That we might begin to notice those who are like Leah in this story. Those for whom society has no use, but who are beloved children in the eyes of God. You see, every generation needs to take these stories and ask these new questions because we face new and different circumstances as the years go by. And rather than discarding the ancient stories and their wisdom that goes with it, we can take them and ask and interrogate and wrestle. And in this generation, we can receive yet another meaning. That they get passed to us, but then they are ours to sing, to tell, to interpret. Rabbi Sachs is famous for saying, in every generation, the teaching of God must be made new. That we don't keep it at arm's distance, just saying, well, this is a holy, sacred thing, and I better not mess with it. We don't throw it in the bin and say, well, it's thousands of years old, and this is a new day and age. Instead, we take it and we make the teaching new. We make it our song to sing, like Nolan does with the Odyssey. Because what we find is these ancient stories are far from archaic and backward, and instead they have something to say to us if we ask the right questions and we're willing to be humble in our listening to them. One rabbi says that the scriptures of Israel are the cultural equivalent to the pyramids of Egypt. That Egypt invested itself in building these massive projects, but Israel invested itself in these stories. And so when we say that they have nothing to say to us, we're missing it, because these people, time and time again, worked with them, told them, listened to them, and were changed by them. And it can be true for us as well today. Who are we ignoring in our world? Who's the Leah in our midst whose story isn't getting told? Whose worldview isn't being shared? Who isn't being identified and noticed? Who are we missing? What might God have to say to us through them if we took the time and paid attention? These people who seem insignificant, how is God bringing forth grace in their lives? Here in Genesis 29, Leah gets off to a rough start in her introduction. But it's interesting, if you follow her life in the chapters that come, Leah gives birth to several different sons, including a man named Judah. And Judah being one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who become the 12 tribes of the people called Israel. Judah, of course, we know, is the family from which Jesus is born. Jesus traces his lineage from Leah. We trace our lineage from Leah. You think people are insignificant? Tempted to believe that they play no role in this world? God is always up to something, even in stories like this. But when we slow down, when we ask questions, when we hold them with open hands, we see the story come to life.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.